Walter Briggs didn't knock. He kicked the boarding house door open with the flat of his boot and grabbed his daughter by the hair. Rosalie didn't scream. She'd stopped screaming at 11 years old because screaming never changed anything, it only made him hit harder. He dragged her down the stairs, through the mud, and straight through the swinging doors of the Crooked Spur Saloon. Every man in the room turned to look. Walter threw her forward so hard she stumbled to her knees on the dirty floor. Then he raised his arms wide and bellowed, "She's deaf. Take her. $20 and she's yours tonight." Rosalie stayed on her knees and heard every filthy word. If that first moment already reached inside your chest and grabbed something, you're in the right place. Subscribe to this channel right now and hit that bell so you never miss what comes next. And drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning, because what happened in that saloon was not the worst night of Rosalie Bennett's life. It was the last night she would ever spend on her knees. She had been pretending to be deaf for 6 years. It started the winter after her mother died, when Rosalie was 18 and the man her father had always been underneath finally had nothing left to hold him back. The first time Walter Briggs raised his hand to her, she cried. The second time, she argued. The third time. She went quiet, and in the quiet she discovered something important. A deaf girl was a different kind of target. You didn't bother explaining yourself to a deaf girl. You didn't bother threatening her. You moved around her the way you moved around furniture present. Necessary and visible. So Rosalie became furniture. She trained herself the way you trained a body for hard labor, slowly, deliberately, with a great deal of pain at the beginning. She sat in dark rooms and made sudden noises behind her own head and forced herself not to flinch. She practiced stillness the way other women practiced needlework. She drilled the reflexes out of herself one by one until what was left was a woman who could stand in a room full of noise with her face perfectly completely blank. It protected her. For 6 years it protected her. Until the night Walter Briggs drank through his last dollar, lost the rest at cards, and decided his daughter was the only asset he had left to liquidate. She'd heard him planning it through the thin wall of the boarding house. Heard his voice, low and ugly, talking to someone she didn't recognize. Heard the words $20 and nobody'll ask questions and she don't know a thing that's happening anyway. Heard the other man laugh. She had lain on her cot that night with her eyes open and thought very carefully about running. She had $7.40 hidden in her left boot. She'd been saving it for 2 years, a dime at a time. Building towards some version of escape she'd never quite been able to picture clearly enough to execute. $7.40 wasn't enough to get anywhere that mattered. It wasn't enough for a stage ticket out of Montana territory. It wasn't enough for a room somewhere safe while she found work. It was enough to get her 40 miles down a mountain road in October with no coat and no destination and a father who would come after her, not because he wanted her back, but because losing her would embarrass him. She knew that run. She'd mapped it in her head 100 times, and it ended the same way every time. So she stayed on the cot and listened to Walter snore through the wall and waited to see what morning brought. Morning brought his hand in her hair and his boot through the door. The Crooked Spur Saloon on a Saturday night held every kind of man that a failing mining town produced, the ones who'd struck nothing and were drinking their disappointment into something manageable. The ones who'd struck a little and were celebrating before it ran out. The gamblers who fed on both kinds and the men who simply had nowhere better to be. Rosalie had been in enough saloons in her life to read a room by its sound before she ever set foot in it. This one was loud and hot and smelled of tobacco and unwashed wool and the particular sour sweetness of too much whiskey in a small space. She was on her knees on the floor before she'd registered all of it. The boards were filthy. She could feel the grit through her thin dress. She kept her eyes down and her hands loose in her lap, and she breathed. And she listened, and she counted. 15 men. Maybe 16. There was a shape near the back wall that might have been a man, or might have been a coat on a hook. And she couldn't resolve it from this angle without looking up. And she wasn't going to look up. She's deaf, Walter announced again. To the room. Can't hear a word you say. $20. Gentlemen. Young, strong, knows how to cook. Whoever puts the money on the bar first. Silence. Then someone near the bar said, "She really deaf, Briggs." "Or you just saying that?" "Watch," Walter said. She felt him move behind her, and she locked every muscle in her body, and Walter Briggs clapped both hands together directly behind her skull, a sound like a rifle shot in a closed space, and Rosalie did not move. Not a flinch, not a breath. The room made a somewhere between impressed and amused. "See?" Walter said, deaf as the mountain. "Pretty," though, said another voice. Closer. A man was walking toward her from the left. She tracked him by the creak of the boards under his boots. Heavy man, right heel worn down more than the left. A slight drag in his step. He stopped about 2 feet from her, and she felt his eyes moving over her, the way hands move over something you're considering buying. What's wrong with her besides the ears? Nothing wrong with her, Walter said. She's healthy. She's quiet. What more do you need? I need to know she ain't simple, the man said. Deaf's one thing. Simple's another. She ain't simple. She's just quiet. How do you know? She can't exactly tell you otherwise. There was laughter. Rosalie filed away each laugh who it belonged to. Where it was positioned. What kind of man produced it? She was building a map of the room the way she always did in dangerous spaces. Not a picture, but a weight distribution. Where the threat was heaviest. Where the gaps were. The gap was behind her father. At the front door. And the gap behind the bar past 5 minutes, leading to a back hallway. She had identified both in the first 30 seconds. She had also identified that she couldn't reach either of them from her knees before someone caught her. And that running in this town tonight, with nowhere to go, was still the same calculation it had been last night on the cot. Not yet. Not yet. Wait. Think. $15, said a voice from the bar older. Careful. The voice of a man who made a habit of sounding reasonable while getting what he wanted. $15, Briggs. More than fair for a girl nobody can have a conversation with. Walter hesitated. Rosalie heard it in his breathing, the small pause of a man running arithmetic on his pride against his desperation. And desperation winning. 15, and that's my ceiling. Briggs. A new voice now. Different from the others, younger, sharper, with something mean in it that didn't bother hiding itself. I'll give you 20 if she comes willingly. Been a while since I had one who came willingly. The laughter that followed was a different kind of laughter. Rosalie's hands tightened in her lap. She felt the shift in the room, the way that particular joke changed the temperature of what was being discussed. Moved it from a transaction into something uglier. She thought, this is the kind of night where waiting stops working. She had begun to calculate the door again, recalculating odds, when a chair scraped back in the far corner of the room. It was not a loud sound, it was in fact a very quiet sound. But something about it cut straight through the noise of the saloon, through the laughter, and the clinking, and the creak of the building in the wind, and the room registered it the way a herd of animals registers a sound that doesn't belong. Conversations dropped. Movement stilled. The man near Rosalie took one unconscious step backward. Footsteps crossed the room. Even, unhurried. The sound of a man who had decided something and was simply now executing the decision without drama. The crowd parted as he came. She could track his path by the way the voices shifted. The way men moved without quite knowing why they were moving. He stopped. A coin hit the bar. Not tossed. It landed a single final sound that silenced the last voices in the room. I'll take her. Low voice. Quiet in the way that didn't need volume because it never had to repeat itself. She felt the room hold its breath. Mercer. Walter's voice changed shape on that single word. Flattened. Got careful around the edges. Didn't see you come in. Didn't come in for this, the voice Mercer said. Came in for supplies. Changed my mind. That's a gold eagle, Walter said. And the greed was right there on top of the words. That's $10. I had a man offering 15. That man, Mercer said, can keep his money. A brief and very heavy. The girl goes with me, he said, willingly or not. But I'll give her the choice. And there it was again. The choice. Rosalie heard it land in the middle of that filthy room, and she felt something she didn't have a clean word for, not hope. Because hope was a thing she'd put away carefully a long time ago. Wrapped it up and set it somewhere it wouldn't get broken again. Not trust, because she didn't know this man from Adam, and she'd been badly wrong about men before. But she heard the word choice in his mouth, and it sounded different from every other word that had been spoken about her in this room tonight. It sounded like he meant it. She raised her head. The man standing at the bar was tall and still and wore a coat gone dark with years of hard use. And his face was the face of someone the weather had worked on for a long time, not old, but deeply specific, like country that had earned every feature. He wasn't looking at Walter. He wasn't looking at the room. He was looking at her, not assessing, not calculating. Something quieter than either of those things, like he was waiting to see what she'd do. And like whatever she did, he'd respect it. She looked at him for 3 full seconds. Then she nodded. There's your answer, Mercer said, and turned back to the bar. Walter made a sound half protest, half resignation, and Rosalie heard in it the exact moment her father stopped thinking of her as a person and started thinking of her as a transaction that had concluded. The coin disappeared off the bar. The room exhaled. And Rosalie got to her feet slowly, deliberately, without help, and walked toward the door. Nobody stopped her. She pushed through the swinging doors and stepped into the cold, and stood for a moment in the dark with the sound of the saloon behind her fading into ordinary noise. And she breathed the night air, which was clean and bitter with pine. And she did not let herself feel anything yet, because she didn't know enough yet to feel the right thing. Mercer came out behind her. He moved to the hitching post, checked his horse with unhurried hands, and then reached into his saddlebag, and turned and held something out to her without a word. A wool blanket, old and heavy, smelling of wood smoke and clean wilderness. She looked at it, looked and took it. Long ride, he said. Mountains get cold fast after dark. He turned back to the horse. You got anything in the boarding house worth collecting? She thought about the room. The thin mattress, her other dress, the $7.40 in her boot. No, she said. He stilled. It was just one word, just no. But she'd spoken it clearly, in a normal voice, without thinking to muffle it or shape it into the flat, slightly delayed response she used when she was performing deafness. She'd simply answered. He didn't turn around immediately. He stood at the horse's flank with his hand on the saddle, and she watched the stillness move through him, not shock, not triumph, just a man receiving a piece of information and quietly deciding what to do with it. Then he turned. His eyes moved to her face and held there. Reading something. All right, he said. That was all. He swung up into the saddle and offered his hand down to her, and she put her foot in the stirrup and pulled herself up without taking it, and settled into the saddle in front of him, and he took the reins on either side of her with a foot of space, kept careful between his chest and her back. And the horse moved forward. Black Hollow fell away. The road climbed into darkness, and the cold deepened, and the stars came out hard and bright above the tree line, and Rosalie sat straight in the saddle and said nothing, and neither did he. And somewhere around the first bend she realized she was waiting for him to start to begin whatever the real conversation was. To name his terms, to lay out what $10 and a gold eagle was supposed to buy him in exchange. He didn't start. A mile passed. 2 miles. The horse picked its way up the mountain road with the confidence of long familiarity. And the pines closed around them on both sides, and somewhere in the dark a mule deer moved through the undergrowth, and the horse's ears swiveled, and Rosalie clocked it before the horse did. Deer, she said, before she could think better of it. In the pines, 30 feet right side, a beat of silence. I know, he said. Heard it 10 seconds back, another beat. You heard it first, though. She said nothing. Deer at 30 feet in the dark, he said quietly. More to himself than to her. In the middle of everything else tonight. You hear everything, don't you? It wasn't quite a question. She didn't answer it, but he let it lie there between them. Undemanding, and they rode on, and the mountain got steeper and colder, and the stopped feeling like pressure and started feeling like something else she didn't have a clean name for. And Rosalie thought very carefully, he is not what I expected. I don't know yet what that means. Knowing what something meant required more information. She was good at getting information. She would wait. The cabin appeared on the far side of a narrow creek, low and solid against a granite face. One window throwing a faint amber light into the dark. A fire already burning inside, she noted the single door. The window unlatched slightly. The rifle visible through the glass, mounted above the fireplace. She noted all of it without moving her eyes, obviously. Silas dismounted and tied the horse and turned. This time she was tired enough that when he offered his hand down, she took it. Her feet hit the ground, and her legs held, and she released his hand before the moment could become anything. And he didn't try to make it anything. Inside, the fire was high, and the room was warm, and the first thing that hit her was the cleanliness of it, not scrubbed. Not staged, just the absence of disorder. The cabin of a man who lived deliberately. She saw the rifle, the skinning knife on the table, the supplies on the shelves, and she registered each without lingering, because lingering looked like casing. And she didn't want him to think she was casing his home. She wasn't. She was just making sure she understood the space she was in. He moved to the fire without speaking, fed it 2 more logs. Then crossed to a chest near the wall and pulled out a second blanket. He set it on the cot in the corner. He set a tin cup on the hearth's edge. Coffee already hot in the pot. Then he pulled a chair up to the fire. Sat in it with his back to the wall that was not between her and the door. Stretched his legs toward the heat and settled his hat down over his eyes. She stood near the door and watched him do all of this. The cot's yours, he said, from under the hat brim. Coffee's hot. I'll be here. You're sleeping in the chair, she said. Reckon so. She waited. Why? Because it's my chair and I'm tired. And because the other option seemed like it might make you nervous. She looked at him for a long moment, the hat over his eyes. The long legs loose toward the fire, the hands easy on the armrests. A man performing nothing. I have money, she said. $7.40. I can pay you back toward what you spent. Keep your money. I don't take charity, ain't charity. The hat brim lifted a fraction. One eye found her. I paid to get you out of a situation. Not to buy anything from you. Those are 2 different transactions. Most men wouldn't see them that way. Most men in that saloon tonight, he said. I wouldn't measure myself against. She was quiet a moment. What do you want from me, she said. Flat, honest. The kind of question that had only ever gotten her in trouble before because the answers were always things she didn't want to hear. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Nothing tonight, he said finally. We can talk in the morning. Figure out what comes next. The hat settled back down. Right now I just want to sleep. She stood at the door for another minute. Then she crossed to the hearth and picked up the cup, and the coffee was strong and so hot it burned her palm a druditten, and she held on anyway and drank half of it standing up. And the heat went down through the cold that had settled in her chest during the ride, and she closed her eyes for 1 second. Just one. Then she sat on the edge of the cot and pulled her boots off the left one last. Carefully, checking that the small leather pouch was still where she'd tucked it, and lay down with the blanket pulled up and her eyes on the ceiling. She did not sleep. She listened to the fire and the wind and his breathing slow into sleep, which it did within minutes, the breathing of a man with nothing left undone. And she thought very carefully about the situation she was in, laying it out the way she laid out every dangerous situation, not with panic, but with the particular cold clarity that had kept her alive through things that should have broken her. She was away from Walter. That was the first true thing. She was in a stranger's cabin in the Montana mountains, and she did not know yet what this man wanted, or what he would become when patience wore thin. She had been wrong about people. She had paid for being wrong. But she had also survived being wrong, and she had one advantage she'd had her entire life. The one advantage nobody had ever thought to account for. She heard everything. She would hear this too, whatever it was, long before it reached her. She tucked that thought in close and let the fire do its work, and somewhere around the second hour of the night she went under, without meaning to, and slept clean and dreamless for the first time in longer than she could remember. She woke to coffee, not the smell of it, the sound. The particular sound of a tin pot lifted from an iron hook, the liquid shift inside it, the careful placement of the cup on the hearthstone. A man moving in a small space with the practiced quiet of someone who had lived alone long enough to know how to exist without disturbing things. She lay still with her eyes open and listened to the whole cabin before she moved. His footsteps even, the fire rebuilt and burning clean. The horse outside, shifting its weight, wind in the pines, lighter than last night, no threat sounds, nothing approaching, nothing waiting. She sat up. He was at the iron stove with his back to her, doing something in a cast pan that smelled like cornmeal and wood smoke. He said, without turning, "Cold water in the basin by the door if you want to wash up. Breakfast in 10 minutes. She crossed to the basin and washed her face and hands and looked at herself in the small square of mirror above it. The same face, tired around the eyes, color in her cheeks from the mountain cold. Still here, she thought, still thinking. She sat at the table and he put a plate down in front of her, fried cornmeal, strips of dried venison, hot, and sat across from her with his own plate, and they ate, and the silence was not uncomfortable. And that itself was strange enough that she kept noticing it. Turning it over, looking for the catch. "How long?" he said. She looked up. He was looking at his plate, not at her. Like the question was just something sitting on the table between them, and he wasn't demanding she pick it up. She thought about the lie. It was right there, ready, the blank look, the slight tilt of the head that meant she hadn't heard. She'd used it so many times it came before the decision. But she was tired. She was so tired of the blank look. 6 years, he nodded once, slow, still looking at his plate. Like 6 years made sense to him, like he was doing the quiet arithmetic of what 6 years of that cost a person. "After my mother died," she said. She didn't know why she kept going. Maybe because the words had been stored up a long time. He was different before, or maybe I was young enough not to see clearly. After she was gone, I could see what he was. She moved the fork in her hand. He liked fear, he liked seeing it, so I took it away from him. Silas looked up then. I went quiet, she said, invisible as I could manage. "A woman who can't hear you can't be afraid of your threats." She looked at him steadily. "It worked. For a long time it worked. Until it didn't," he said. "Until the money ran out," she said, "and I was the last thing he had to sell." The fire popped. Wind pressed against the window glass. Outside, a bird started up somewhere in the pines, a high, clear sound that didn't belong to winter, and she heard it and identified it without thinking, and then realized he'd noticed her notice it. His eyes had tracked to the window for a fraction of a second, and then back to her. He picked up his coffee cup. "You heard me say it was your choice," he said. "Not a question." "Yes. And that's why you nodded." She set her fork down. "There were 15 men in that room making decisions about me," she said. "You were the first one who asked." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face, not performance. Not sentiment, just something real and very quiet that came and went before she could name it cleanly. "Reckon that's the way it ought to be," he said. "Every time." She picked her fork back up. They finished breakfast without talking, and the morning light came through the single window and lay across the table between them. And the fire burned steady, and somewhere outside the bird called again through the cold pine air. And Rosalie sat in the warmth and thought, I don't know what this is. I don't know what he is, but I know how to listen. And I will. The second morning was harder than the first. Not because anything went wrong, because nothing did. And Rosalie didn't know what to do with that. She woke before him, tracked his breathing from the chair. Still slow and even, still the breathing of a man, with nothing to hide in his sleep, and she lay on the cot for a full 10 minutes trying to find the thing she was missing. The angle, the hidden cost. 6 years of surviving her father had taught her one lesson above all others. Kindness without a price tag didn't exist. Someone was always keeping a ledger. Someone always came to collect. Silas Mercer had given her a cot, 2 blankets, coffee, and breakfast. He had slept in a chair. He had asked one question over eggs and cornmeal, and then let the answer sit where she put it without pressing for more. She was still looking for the ledger. She got up quietly, pulled on her boots, left one last, checking the pouch, and crossed to the basin, and washed her face in the cold water, and stood looking at herself in that small square of mirror, and had the same thought she'd had yesterday morning. Still here, still thinking, but today there was something else underneath it. Still waiting for the other boot to drop. You sleep all right? She turned. Silas was awake in the chair, hat in his hands, watching her with those patient, weathered eyes. Fine, she said. Liar, he said. Not unkind. Just matter of fact, the way you'd sit's cold outside. You were awake till past midnight, I heard you. She looked at him. I sleep light, he said. Mountain habit. He set the hat on his knee. Didn't sleep much either, if it makes you feel better. Why not? He stood up from the chair and stretched. Slow, like a man putting himself back together after a long night. Thinking, he said. About what? About what happens next. He crossed to the stove and began building the fire back up from last night's coals. You can't stay here indefinitely, Rosalie. Not without it meaning something to the people in town. And I don't want to make your situation worse than it already is. He glanced back at her. But you can't go back down the mountain either. Not until we figure out what you're going back to. She sat down at the table. Walter won't look for me, she said. He got his money. I was a transaction. Transactions don't come looking for you. Maybe. He didn't sound convinced. He set the coffee pot on the stove and turned around and leaned against it with his arms crossed. And if he does come, then I'll deal with that when it happens. That's not a plan. That's the only kind of plan I've ever had, she said. The kind where you deal with what's in front of you because you don't have enough information yet to deal with anything else. He looked at her for a moment. That's actually not a bad philosophy, he said. It's kept me alive, I noticed. He turned back to the coffee. All right. Then for right now, what's in front of you is breakfast. And after that, whatever you want to do with the day. I've got work. You can help or you can, your choice. There was that word again. She watched him work at the stove and thought about the word and what it kept doing to her every time he used it, the way it landed different in his mouth than it did in anyone else's. Not like a courtesy, not like a performance of respect, but like a plain statement of fact, your choice, like it was obvious. Like the alternative had never occurred to him. She wasn't sure what to do with a man like that. She decided to help with breakfast. The first week passed in a rhythm she hadn't expected and couldn't quite name. Silas woke early, worked hard, talked when he had something to say, and didn't manufacture conversation to fill the silence. Rosalie moved through the cabin and the surrounding land with the careful attention of someone mapping a new territory, not suspicious exactly, but thorough. She learned the sounds of the place. The particular creak of the cabin's front wall in cold wind. The way the horse stamped twice before it wanted water. The bird in the eastern pines that sang exactly 3 times each morning at the same hour. Reliable as a clock, She learned Silas too, the way she learned everything by listening for what wasn't said. He didn't ask her questions. That was the first thing she noticed. He didn't press. He didn't circle back to things she declined to answer. When she went quiet, he went quiet too, and the silence between them was never the loaded, threatening kind, never the silence that meant he was building toward something. That meant the real conversation was being held back like a fist. It was just silence. She didn't trust it, but she was starting to trust him. And she knew the difference. On the fourth day, she asked him why he'd come to Black Hollow in the first place. They were outside. He was splitting firewood with the focused efficiency of a man who'd done it 10,000 times. And she was stacking it against the cabin wall, and she said it in the middle of an ordinary motion. The way she'd learned to ask difficult things sideways. During work, where there was no eye contact to make it heavy. "Told you," he said. "Supplies, you come down every month for supplies? Every 6 weeks. Roughly. And you were just going to ride back up with your flour and your ammunition, and that was the night." He split a log without looking at her. That was the plan. What changed? He set the axe head down on the stump and looked at the stack of wood she'd built. It was neat, tighter than his usual stacking, she suspected. "You looked up," he said. She went still. "When I put the coin on the bar," he said. "Every other person in that room was watching me. You were the only one watching yourself." Calculating. He picked the axe back up. "And then you looked up at exactly the right second." Like you'd made a decision, he swung. The log split clean. "I wanted to know what you'd decided." She looked at him. "That's it," she said. "Respect," he said. Quiet. Certain, a woman in that room in that situation. And she's still thinking. Still choosing. He stacked the split logs himself this time. Matching her pattern. That deserved better than what Briggs was selling her into. She didn't say anything for a moment. "You didn't know me," she said. "I knew enough." He picked up another log. "Knew you weren't deaf. Knew you were smarter than any man in that room, including your father. Knew you'd say no to the wrong person if you got the chance." A pause. That was enough. She stacked wood for another minute and thought about the fact that he had seen all of that in the 30 seconds between walking across a saloon and putting a coin on a bar. "You were a scout," she said. "During the war." He stopped. She kept stacking. "My father talked about you. Before last night." "I mean, not to me. I wasn't supposed to be able to hear him." She kept her voice even. "He told someone once that Silas Mercer could read a battlefield before the shooting started. That you never lost a man you personally let out." A long silence. "Your father's got a big mouth," Silas said finally. "He's got a lot of qualities I could do without." She set the last log in the row. "Is it true?" Another silence. She'd learned to read his silences now. The short ones meant he was deciding how honest to be. The long ones meant the honesty was going to cost him something. This was a long one. "Lost plenty of men," he said. "Not the ones I was responsible for." He picked up the axe again. "Difference between what you can control and what you can't. Took me a long time to learn it. What made you stop?" Scouting. He swung the axe, the log split. He stacked both halves before he answered. "Had a family," he said. He kept splitting. "Came home from the war and tried to build something. Ranch down in the valley, didn't take." Another swing. "Fever came through one winter. Bad one. I was out with the cattle." He stopped. Set the axe down again. Looked at the wood in his hands like he'd forgotten he was holding it. "By the time I got back," he set the log on the stump. "Came up here after," he said. "Been here since." She looked at his back, the set of his shoulders. The particular stillness of a man who had just handed you something he didn't hand out easily and was now waiting to see if you treated it carefully. She treated it carefully. "I'm sorry," she said, "just that." Not embellished, not chased with questions. He nodded once. Face still turned away. "Long time ago," he said. But his voice was slightly different than it had been a minute ago, rougher, and she heard it and said nothing. and they went back to the wood. And the sound of the axe came down steady and clean in the cold air. That night she slept 6 full hours. She noted it in the morning the way she noted everything clinically. Carefully, as data. 6 hours was the most she'd slept at one stretch and she could not remember how long. Years, possibly. She lay there in the early dark and tried to identify what was different, and came up with the same answer she didn't entirely want to accept. She felt safer. Not safe. She wasn't ready to think the word safe without qualifiers. But safer she could sit with. Safer was a direction, not a destination, and directions she knew how to navigate. On the 6th morning, everything changed. She was outside at the water barrel cold. Gray morning, frost still on the ground when she heard it. Footsteps on the path below the cabin. 2 sets. Coming up from the valley road at a pace that wasn't in a hurry because it didn't think it needed to be. She had the water barrel tap closed and was inside the cabin door before the shapes came around the bend. "Silas," she said. He was at the table cleaning his rifle, and he looked up at her face and put the rifle down and stood in one motion. "How many?" he said. 2, coming up slow. He moved to the window, not in front of it. Beside it, looking at an angle. She watched him identify what she'd already identified, and watched his face for what he saw in them that she might have missed. "Don't know the second one," he said. "The first one's Frank Geller. He runs the livery down in Black Hollow." He looked at her. "He drinks with your father." She felt her stomach drop about 3 inches, and then locked it in place and lifted her chin. "What does he want up here? Nothing good." Silas picked the rifle back up. "Go to the back of the cabin. Stay away from the window." "I'm not hiding," she said. He looked at her. Something moved in his face, not quite surprise, but close to it. "I know you're not," he said. "I'm asking you to let me find out what they want before we make decisions. Information first." She thought about it. It was, she acknowledged, the same logic she applied to everything. "All right," she said. "But I'll hear everything, I know you will." He almost smiled. "That's why I'm not worried." She moved to the back of the cabin and Silas went to the door, and she stood very still with her arms at her sides, and she listened. The footsteps stopped outside, a voice raspy, deliberate. The voice of a man who'd spent his life being listened to and had learned to perform for it. "Frank Geller." "Morning, Mercer." "Cold one." "Morning," Silas said. Flat. No reciprocating warmth. You're a hard man to find when you don't want to be found. That's the idea. A small sound, a laugh that wasn't entirely comfortable. "We ain't here to make trouble," Geller said. "Just a message." From Walter Briggs. Rosalie's hands tightened at her sides. "Walter Briggs doesn't have anything to say that I want to hear," Silas said. "He's saying it anyway." A pause, and she heard paper, the sound of something being unfolded. Stiff and official. "He's saying the girl wasn't his to sell. Says she's the ward of the county, technically, on account of some arrangement with the land office he made last year when he was behind on his claim fees. Says the transaction you conducted wasn't legal." Another pause. "Says you owe him $20 for what was, legally speaking, county property." Silence. It was the kind of silence that had a shape to it. "That's creative," Silas said. "It's legal," said the second. New voice. Younger. Flat in the way that men who've rehearsed something are flat. "There's a document signed by the county recorder." "Let me see it," Silas said. A shuffling sound. "Then rear it through the door is fine." A pause, and then the paper came through the gap, and she heard Silas take it and unfold it, and the silence stretched out while he read it. Rosalie had been very still. Now she moved. She came forward, not running, not frantic, just walking with the deliberate pace of someone who has made a decision, and she was at Silas's shoulder before he turned. "Let me read it," she said quietly. Silas looked at her and then handed her the paper without a word. She read it. It took her less than 30 seconds, because she had always read fast, another skill she'd kept invisible. Because a deaf-mute girl who read documents too quickly drew the wrong kind of attention, and what she read made the cold in her stomach get very specific and very sharp. It was a ward document. dated her name. Misspelled by one letter. Walter Briggs listed as her legal guardian on behalf of the county. Signed by a man called Harris County Recorder, Black Hollow. "This is forged," she said. Both men outside went quiet. Miss Geller started. "The spelling of my name is wrong," she said. And her voice was steady and clear, and she made no attempt to lower it. "My name is Rosalie Bennett. This document says Rosalie Bennett." 1T. She looked at the paper. The county recorder's signature is dated March of this year, but the document references a land claim filing that didn't happen until June. "I heard my father discuss the filing. It was June." She looked up. "You can't sign a document in March referencing an event in June unless you wrote the signature after the fact and dated it backward." A very long silence from outside. Silas was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. "Where'd she come from?" The second man said low to Geller. "Where did you find her?" Geller said louder. To Silas. "She found herself," Silas said. "She's been doing it her whole life." He took the document back from Rosalie. "You can tell Walter Briggs that this document is fraudulent. That I intend to have it verified by the county courthouse in Helena if he presses the matter. And that if he comes up this mountain himself, he will leave lighter than he came." He looked at Geller through the gap. "Are we clear?" "Clear," Geller said. Flat now. The performance was gone, the footsteps retreated. Rosalie listened to them go all the way down the path until the sound faded into the general noise of the mountain. And then she stood in the open doorway and breathed the cold air and said nothing. Silas stood beside her. "Ward of the county," she said finally. "It won't hold," he said. "Not with what you just identified. He'll try something else," she said. "He always does. He runs out of whiskey, and then he runs out of ideas, and then he finds a new one." She looked at the path. "He's not going to stop." "No," Silas said, "he's not." She looked at him. "That bothers you. A man forging legal documents to reclaim a daughter he sold in a saloon?" He looked back at her. "Yeah, that bothers me. What are you going to do about it?" He was quiet for a moment. "I was thinking," he said, "that you might want to be part of deciding that." She looked at him for a long beat. There it was again. She almost said something about it, about the fact that he kept doing this, kept handing her back the decisions about her own life like they were hers by right. Like it was the most natural thing in the world. But she didn't say it. Because saying it would mean explaining why it was remarkable. And explaining that would mean saying more about what her life had been than she was ready to say standing in a cold doorway. "I'll make coffee," she said instead. "Good idea," he said. "We've got some thinking to do." They sat at the table for an hour and they talked. Not the careful, measured talk of two people getting acquainted. They were past that. Some invisible line having been crossed somewhere between the wood splitting and the Ward document, and 30 seconds of her reading legal language out loud in a doorway. This was working talk. The talk of two people with a shared problem, laying it out between them and looking at it from every side. Silas knew Walter Briggs by reputation, which was not a good reputation. A man who'd come to Montana Territory 15 years ago full of big claims and bad judgment. Who'd worked 3 different mining stakes into the ground, not through bad luck, but through the particular combination of laziness and impulsiveness that made men blame the land for what was really their own failures. He had debts in Black Hollow that Rosalie hadn't known about, not small ones. "The Ward document is a stall," she said, wrapping both hands around her cup. "He doesn't actually want me back. He wants leverage. He thinks if he can claim legal ownership, he can sell that claim to someone who'll pay more than $10. Silas looked at her. "You figured that out from a forged document and 2 minutes of listening." "I figured it out from 6 years of knowing how he thinks," she said. "He always finds the angle that sounds like a principle, but is actually just money." She looked down at her cup. "He told himself he was providing for me, all those years. That's how he explained the hitting, and the she stopped. Started again. He always needed it to sound like something other than what it was." Silas was quiet. The angle right now, she said, sounds like a father exercising legal rights over a daughter who was taken from him by a stranger. It feels righteous, even to him. But what he actually wants is to find someone who will pay him more than $10 for the right to stop him complaining about it. So he'll sell the claim, Silas said. Or try to use it to extort money from you directly. She looked at him steadily. He'll try you first. You paid $10 easily. He'll want to know if there's more where that came from. There isn't, Silas said. Not defensively, just factually. He doesn't know that. Silas leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. She'd learned this too, that he thought better looking up than looking straight ahead. That the ceiling of his own cabin was where he went when the problem needed more space. What do we do, he said, if he comes up here himself? She thought about it. The honest answer, the one she didn't get yet, was that the thought of her father coming up that mountain didn't frighten her the way it once had. She was aware of this. She was aware that something had shifted in her since the saloon. Since the ride up the mountain, since 6 mornings in this cabin, and the slow accumulation of being treated like a person with a mind and a will, and the right to read documents out loud without being told to be quiet. She was aware that she was different than she'd been a week ago. She wasn't sure how different yet. He won't come alone, she said. He's never been brave on his own. He'll bring someone who is. She turned her cup on the table. When he does come, and he will come, Silas. I know him, I need to be ready to face him. Not hide. Not let you handle it. I need to be the one who talks. He held her gaze. You sure about that? I'm sure that if you handle it alone. He'll just come back, she said. He needs to hear it from me. He needs to understand that I'm not what he left in that saloon. A pause. I need to understand that, too, honestly. Something moved in Silas's face. Warm and quick and gone before she could examine it cleanly. All right, he said. All right, you'll talk, he said. I'll be there. He picked up his cup. Which means between now and whenever he shows up, we'd better make sure you've got something worth saying. She looked at him. I already do. I know, he said. I'm not talking about arguments. He set the cup down and stood up. Come on. I want to show you something. He took her outside and around to the back of the cabin, where the land opened up into a long, clear stretch of flat ground before the tree line, a natural break in the pines that ran maybe 40 yards and was clearly used. From the look of the ground, he handed her his rifle. She looked at it. You know how to shoot? He said. I know the idea of it, she said. My mother had a pistol. She showed me the basics once. Basics won't do, he said. Not up here, not in winter. He positioned himself beside her. Not in front, not taking the rifle back. Hold it like this. She let him adjust her grip and found that his hands on her forearms were completely impersonal, the hands of a man showing a skill, not a man looking for contact, and she felt herself relax a fraction without deciding to. Now, he said, stepping back. The target's the knot on the 3rd pine from the left. Take your time. She took her time. The shot went wide and to the left by about 2 feet. Wind, he said. You compensate right. He crossed his arms and watched her. Try again. She tried again. The second shot clipped the tree 6 inches above the knot. Better, he said. I can hear your skepticism, she said. That wasn't skepticism, he said. That was genuine better. You adjusted for the wind, he paused. Most people don't adjust the second shot. They repeat the mistake. She looked at the tree. Try again, he said. She tried again. The 3rd shot hit the knot dead center. The crack of it rolled out across the mountain and came back at them, changed, softened by the trees, and she stood there with the rifle in her hands and her ears ringing slightly and the smell of powder in the cold air, and felt something she hadn't felt in so long she almost didn't recognize it. Like she'd just gotten something back she'd forgotten was missing. Natural, Silas said quietly behind her. She lowered the rifle. I just got lucky. You got lucky once, he said. You made 2 corrections before that. That's not luck. That's thinking. She turned around and looked at him, and he was watching her with that expression, the serious, patient one that didn't perform anything, and she thought about what it meant that this man had gotten up from a chair in a saloon and crossed a room and put a coin on a bar for no reason, except that he'd watched her think. She thought about what that said about him. She thought about what it was starting to do to her. Again, she said. He handed her another cartridge. They stayed out there for 2 hours. By the end of it, her shoulder ached and her ears were ringing, and she had hit the knot 7 more times out of 11 attempts. And Silas had barely spoken except to correct her stance twice. And when they went back inside and she set the rifle on the table and sat down, she was tired in a way that was different from any tired she'd been in years. It was the tiredness of using something that had been folded up and put away. The particular ache of capacity that had been stored instead of spent. "Same time tomorrow," she said. He was stoking the fire. "If you want," she said. He didn't answer. But she heard the sound of him almost saying something and stopping and deciding to let it wait. She let it wait too. She'd learned that some things came out better if you didn't chase them. That night she lay on the cot and listened to him breathe in the chair and thought about the Ward document and her father's next move and the feel of the rifle's weight settling into her hands. And under all of it, running quiet like a creek under winter ice. She thought about the way Silas Mercer had said natural in the cold mountain air. And the way it had landed in her chest like something she'd been waiting a very long time to hear. She didn't call it what it was. Not yet. But she knew what she was listening for now. In the spaces between his words. And that was new. That was something she hadn't listened for in a very long time. Outside, the wind came down off the high granite and moved through the pines, and the fire burned low in the grate and somewhere below the mountain. In the dark valley, Black Hollow went about its mean and ordinary business. And Walter Briggs sat in the saloon with Geller's report and a new glass of whiskey and looked at the door and thought about his next move. Rosalie knew he was thinking. She was thinking faster. 3 weeks on the mountain changed a person. Rosalie knew this the way she knew everything, not from being told, but from listening to herself closely enough to hear the difference. The woman who had knelt on the floor of the Crooked Spurs saloon with her eyes down and her hands loose in her lap was still in her somewhere. Still available when she needed her, the way a tool you've used for years stays familiar in the hand even after you've set it aside. But she wasn't the only thing in Rosalie's hands anymore. Every morning before breakfast, she and Silas went out to the flat stretch behind the cabin. Every morning she shot until her shoulder burned, and her ears rang, and her eye had learned something new about wind and distance, and the particular way a rifle settled into a body that had decided to trust it. Every afternoon she worked firewood, water, the cabin's accumulation of small necessary tasks, and Silas worked beside her. And they talked the way people talked when they'd moved past the careful stage and into something more real. In half sentences, in silences that meant things, in the shorthand of two people who'd started to know each other's rhythms without planning to. She learned that he made coffee too strong because he'd learned to drink it that way in the field and had never bothered to correct it. She learned that he went quiet at dusk, the way other men went quiet in church, that the last light on the mountains did something to him he didn't have words for and didn't try to find them. She learned that he was funny occasionally, in the dry and completely unannounced way of men who'd spent too long alone to bother setting up a joke. He learned things about her too, she knew. She could tell by the way he'd started adjusting, without being asked, the coffee slightly less punishing. The tasks distributed without discussion, in a way that accounted for what she was good at. The particular silence he offered, when she went somewhere in her head that she wasn't ready to talk about yet. He never asked where she went. She was starting to understand that this was not indifference. It was the most deliberate kind of respect she'd ever been shown. On the 22nd day, she told him about her mother. They were at the table after supper, and the fire was burning low, and neither of them had moved to build it back up. The way you didn't always move immediately when something comfortable settled over you. She didn't plan to start talking. She was looking at the fire and thinking about the word natural in the cold air, and then she was talking. Her name was June, she said. She came to Montana Territory from Ohio with my father when she was 23. She thought it was going to be something. She turned her cup on the table. She was the one who taught me to read. Not from a school, there wasn't one near enough. From whatever she could get her hands on. Legal notices. The back of supply receipts. She said it didn't matter what you read, as long as you understood that words were the thing people used to control each other. And if you could read them, you couldn't be controlled as easily. Silas was listening. Not performing listening, actually doing it, in the particular still way of him that meant all his attention was in one place. She was right, Rosalie said. That Word document Geller brought up. I read it in 30 seconds. I knew what was wrong with it in 35. She paused. My mother gave me that. She sounds like a formidable woman, Silas said. She was. Rosalie looked at the fire. She was also tired. By the end, she was so tired. Not from the work, she didn't mind work. From the weight of him. From holding everything together that he kept breaking. She was quiet for a moment. I used to tell myself she was strong enough, that the tired was temporary. That she'd come back to herself. She stopped. She didn't come back. The fever took her in 3 days, and I think part of her was already somewhere else by the time it came. The fire popped. Silas said nothing, and it was exactly the right thing. I was angry at her for a long time, Rosalie said. And this was the part she'd never said out loud, not once. Not to anyone. For leaving me with him. For not fighting harder to stay. She shook her head. That's a terrible thing to think about your mother. It's an honest thing, Silas said. Honest and terrible can be the same thing. She looked at him. I was angry at my wife, he said, low and even, after the fever. For a while, he looked at the table, for leaving me with all of it. The ranch, the silence, he stopped, turned his cup. I knew it wasn't her fault. Knowing and feeling aren't always running the same direction. No, she said. They're not. They sat with that for a while, the two of them, and the low fire, and the truth that knowing and feeling ran on different tracks. And it was the most honest Rosalie had been with another human being since her mother died, and it sat in her chest with a weight that was not quite grief, and not quite relief, but somewhere between the two. I don't think I've told anyone that before, she said. About being angry at her. Sometimes things need to wait for the right person to say them to, Silas said. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked back at the fire, and she thought. There it is. The thing she'd been listening for in the spaces between his words. She hadn't known what shape it would take when it arrived. She hadn't known it would be this quiet or this ordinary or this entirely unlike everything she'd been told love was supposed to feel like. She filed it carefully away. She wasn't ready for it yet. But she knew what it was. The next morning she was at the water barrel before first light when she heard the horse. One horse. Coming up the mountain road at an unhurried pace that bothered her more than urgency would have urgency meant impulse. An impulse she knew how to manage. Unhurried meant calculated. She was inside the cabin with the door closed before the sound reached the clearing. Horse, she said one. Silas was up already, he'd heard it, too. She realized, just slightly after she had. And the fact that he was already moving before she finished the sentence told her he'd been expecting something. How far? Maybe 6. She crossed to the table. It's not Geller. Wrong weight in the step, this horse is heavier. And there's something off about the rhythm. Rider's not comfortable up here. He looked at her with that particular expression, the one that had started appearing in the second week. Where something shifted in his eyes when she did something he hadn't predicted. You can tell that from the sound. I've been listening to this mountain for 3 weeks, she said. I know what belongs on it. He picked up his rifle. Move to the wall beside the window. Stay back, he said. Not a command, a request, the way he always framed it. Until we know who it is. She was already at the back wall and already listening too hard to bother arguing. The horse stopped outside. A voice came through the door. Not Geller. Not the younger man from before. This one was smooth and measured, and had the deliberate quality of a man who'd rehearsed what he intended to say. "Mr. Mercer, my name is Douglas Hale. I'm the Deputy County Recorder out of Helena. I apologize for the hour. I've been riding since yesterday." Silas looked at Rosalie. She shook her head slightly. She didn't know the name. He opened the door. The man outside was 40 or so, thin, with the look of someone who worked indoors and had not enjoyed the ride up. He was holding a leather satchel and his hat in the same hand, which meant he'd taken the hat off before knocking, which meant he wanted to be perceived as respectful. Rosalie listened from the back wall and catalogued him and waited. "Mr. Mercer," Hale said again, "I'm not here about the ward document. I want to be clear about that. That document has already been flagged as potentially fraudulent by our office. We received a letter from someone who'd seen a copy and had concerns about the dating." He paused. That letter was anonymous, but the concerns were specific enough that we're investigating. Silas said nothing. "I'm here about something else," Hale said. "Something larger." He opened the satchel. "May I come in?" Silas stepped aside. Hale came in and stopped when he saw Rosalie. He looked at her for a moment, reassessing something. And then he nodded to her, with the brief professional courtesy of a man deciding she was relevant. "Miss Bennett," he said. She came forward from the wall. "Yes. The anonymous letter mentioned you by name," he said, "and mentioned that you had identified specific irregularities in the ward document." He looked at her steadily. "Were you the one who wrote it?" "No," she said. He waited. "But I know who did," she said. She didn't know. She was guessing. But she looked at Silas and found him looking back at her with an expression that confirmed it, and she felt something sharp and warm move through her chest. He had written to Helena. He had sent a letter to the county office without telling her, without making it a thing he expected gratitude for, without even mentioning it. He'd just done it the way he did everything quietly. Practically because it was the right next step. She turned back to Hale. "What's the larger matter?" she said. Hale set the satchel on the table and opened it. He pulled out a stack of documents, not copies, originals, with official seals she recognized from her mother's careful lessons in reading the language of legal paper. "Walter Briggs," he said, "has been working with the county recorder in Black Hollow, a man named Harris, to file fraudulent claim documents on behalf of 3 different mining operations over the past 2 years. Not ward documents, land claims, mineral rights." He spread 3 papers on the table, each one signed and dated by Harris, each one on close examination, showing irregularities similar to what you identified in your ward document. He looked at her. Wrong dates, misspelled names that appear on legitimate documents correctly, signatures that reference events that hadn't happened yet. Rosalie looked at the papers. She looked at them for 45 seconds while both men waited. "This one," she said, pointing to the second document, without touching it. "This signature is in a different ink than the text above it. The text is older, you can tell by the fading. The signature is newer." She moved to the third. "This filing references a survey completed by a man named Gruber in April. But I heard my father tell someone that Gruber didn't come up from Bozeman until August. He was complaining about the fee." She stood up straight. "If Gruber's survey is dated April and Gruber wasn't in the territory until August." Someone added the reference after the fact. Hale was staring at her. "How do you know these things?" he said. It wasn't disrespectful. It was genuinely bewildered. "I've been listening to my father conduct business for 6 years," she said. He thought I couldn't hear him. She looked at the documents. "I heard everything." A silence. Then Hale said quietly, "To no one in particular. Good Lord. What does this mean?" Silas said from the wall where he'd been standing. "It means Walter Briggs is not just a man who sold his daughter in a saloon," Hale said. He's a man who has been systematically defrauding land claimants in Black Hollow and the surrounding area for 2 years, with the assistance of a corrupt county recorder. He looked at Rosalie. And the best witness we have to the details of those transactions is apparently a woman everyone in Black Hollow thought was deaf. The silence that followed was long and had several different textures in it. Rosalie was the one who broke it. "What do you need from me?" she said. Hale looked at her steadily. "A formal statement," he said. "Everything you heard. Dates, names, specifics, whatever you remember." "I remember everything," she said. And she wasn't saying it to impress him. She was saying it because it was the plain, factual truth. She had been storing 6 years of conversations in the back of her mind the way you stored provisions for winter against a time when they'd be needed, even when she didn't know yet what the need would look like. Now she knew. "Then we have a great deal to discuss," Hale said. He stayed 3 hours. Rosalie talked for most of it. Not frantically, not emotionally, with the same precise, organized calm she brought to reading documents or adjusting for wind when she shot. She laid out names and dates and overheard conversations in the order they'd occurred, and Hale wrote fast and still fell behind and had to ask her to slow twice, and each time she slowed without impatience and waited for him to catch up. Silas made coffee and sat to one side and didn't interrupt, and she was aware of him there the way you were aware of solid ground underfoot, not thinking about it, just knowing it was there. When Hale finally put his pen down and read back through what he'd written, his expression had changed from professional to something closer to stunned. "Miss Bennett," he said, "what you've given me here is enough to bring criminal charges against Walter Briggs, against Harris the county recorder, and potentially against 2 of the mining operators who filed these claims." He looked at her. "You understand what that means for your father?" "I understand," she said. "He'll know it came from you. He'll know," she said. "He's always known I was smarter than he wanted me to be. He just thought he'd taken away all my ways of using it." She looked at Hale steadily. He was wrong about that. Hale gathered his papers and stood and put on his hat, and at the door he turned and said, "I have to ask, all those years living with him, hearing all of it, knowing what he was doing, why didn't you leave sooner? Find someone to tell?" She looked at him for a moment. "Who would have believed a deaf girl?" she said. He had no answer for that. After he left, the cabin was very quiet. Rosalie sat at the table and looked at the place where the documents had been and felt the particular weight of something that had been carrying her for years and had just shifted, not lifted. Not yet, but shifted. Changed position. The weight of 6 years of everything she'd heard and stored and never been able to use. Finally beginning to move. Silas sat down across from her. "You wrote to Helena," she said. "Seemed like the right step," he said. "You didn't tell me. I didn't want to get your hopes up if they didn't take it seriously." He looked at the table. "I should have told you anyway." She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "you should have." He met her eyes. "I'm sorry." She nodded. "Why did you do it?" she said. "Write to them. You could have stayed out of it. This is not your fight." He was quiet for a long moment. "You know that thing you said," he said slowly, "about your mother teaching you that words were how people controlled each other. And if you could read them, you were harder to control." He looked at her. "Your father spent 6 years trying to control you by making sure nobody would listen to you. That's not something I can watch happen and stay out of." She held his gaze. "Besides," he said quieter, "it's become my business." She didn't ask him what he meant. She knew what he meant, and the thing she'd filed away carefully 3 nights ago. The thing she hadn't been ready to call by its right name. Moved in her chest with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire and everything to do with the man sitting across from her who had written a letter to a county office on her behalf and not said a word about it because he hadn't needed her gratitude. He'd just needed her to be safe. She looked at the table and breathed and then said, "I want to go to Black Hollow." He went still. "Not today," she said. Not unprepared, "but I want to go back." She looked up. "Hale is going to file those charges. When he does, My father is going to come up here. I told you that. I know him. He's not going to wait to be arrested. He's going to come here first to try to stop me from saying anything else. I know, Silas said. So I need to not be hiding up here when he does, she said. I need to be in Black Hollow, where there are witnesses. Where there's a lawman such as he is. Where what I say and what he says can be heard by more than just you and me. She paused. I need to walk back into that town on my own 2 feet and say what I know in public. So he can't make it disappear. Silas looked at her for a long time. She could see him working through it, not the question of whether she was right. Because she could tell he knew she was right, but the other question underneath it. The one he wasn't going to say out loud. She heard it anyway. In the quality of his silence. Are you ready? 3 weeks ago I was on my knees in a saloon floor, she said. Today I gave a county officer enough testimony to bring 3 men up on fraud charges. She held his gaze. I've been ready. I just needed to remember it. He was quiet for one more moment. Then he stood up. We'll leave at first light, he said. I'll ride with you. A pause if you want company. She looked at him. The firelight was low and the cabin was warm, and outside the mountain was going dark the way it did at this hour. The particular blue dark of high country in late fall. And she sat there looking at this man who had gotten up from a chair in a saloon, because she was thinking. And she thought, I want company. I have wanted company for a very long time. I want company, she said. He nodded once. She went to bed early that night, and lay looking at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of the cabin settle around her, the fire. The wind, his breathing in the chair, and she thought about Black Hollow, and her father, and the morning that was coming. And underneath all of it, running steady and clear as the creek outside. She thought about the fact that tomorrow she was going to walk back into the place where she had been on her knees. And she was going to do it upright, with her voice intact and 6 years of truth stored up, and finally somewhere to put it. She closed her eyes. She slept 4 hours and then woke suddenly. In the dead of night, with the specific alertness of someone whose body had registered something before the mind caught up. She lay still and listened. The fire had burned to coals. Silas was breathing even and deep. The horse outside was quiet. The wind had dropped. Everything was exactly as it should be. Except there was a smell. Something her body had learned from years of sharing space with Walter Briggs, the particular combination of cold air and unwashed wool, the specific cheap brand of tobacco he'd smoked since as long as she could remember. She was on her feet before she finished the thought. Silas, she said, low and sharp. He was up in one motion. The hat gone. Rifle in hand before she'd said the second syllable. He looked at her face and read it. How close, he said. She crossed to the window and listened to the dark without putting her face near the glass. He's already here, she said. And from outside, Walter Briggs's voice came through the cabin wall. And it was not the drunk, loud voice of the saloon. It was quiet, controlled, the most frightening version of him she knew. Rosalie, he said, come out, we need to talk. She stood in the dark cabin with the rifle at the edge of her vision and her father's voice in her ears and 6 years of everything she'd survived rising up in her chest. And she felt the moment balance on its edge, the old fear on one side. Everything she'd become on the other, and she breathed once. Slow and deliberate, and she straightened her spine. She crossed to the door. Silas moved to her left shoulder without being asked. She put her hand on the latch. Rosalie, Walter said again. Outside, in that controlled voice that had always meant the worst kind of danger. I'm not leaving without you. She looked at Silas. He looked at her. His expression said, your call. She lifted the latch and opened the door. The cold hit her face the moment she stepped through the door. Walter Briggs was standing 10 feet from the cabin. And he had not come alone. Geller was behind him and to the left. And there was a third man she didn't recognize, broad. Quiet, the kind of man you hired when you wanted the threat to be visible without being stated. He was holding a lantern and not much else, but he didn't need to be holding anything else. His presence was the message. Walter looked at her the way he always looked at her when he was being careful, like she was a problem he was in the process of solving. Not the drunk saloon look, this was the sober, cold-eyed version. And she had always been more afraid of this version than the other one. "You look well," he said. "You rode through the night to tell me that?" she said. His jaw tightened. "I rode through the night because you've been talking to people you shouldn't be talking to." He took one step forward. "That man from Helena, Hale, I know he came up here." "I know what you told him." "Then you know it's already done." "It's not done," Walter said. And his voice had an edge under the control now, like a blade under cloth. "Hale's a deputy recorder. He can file papers all he wants. Papers take time. Time can be managed." He looked past her at Silas, standing just behind her left shoulder, and something moved across his face, not fear, but the careful recalculation of a man adjusting his approach. "This doesn't have to go the way you're pushing it." "Mercer, wasn't aware I was pushing anything," Silas said. "Quiet. Even. You've had my daughter up here for 3 weeks," Walter said. "That's its own kind of problem. A man in your position. A young woman alone, there are stories that write themselves. Stories that make what she says to county officials a lot less credible." Rosalie felt the words land the way he'd intended them, to design to humiliate, to reduce her, to remind her that the world had ways of making women small that had nothing to do with their actual guilt or innocence. She felt the familiar flinch start somewhere in her chest. She shut it down. "You're going to threaten my reputation," she said. "To a man who got up from a chair in a saloon because he saw you try to sell me for $20. She kept her voice level. "You think that story helps you?" Walter's eyes came back to her. "Watch your mouth, girl." "I've been watching my mouth for 6 years," she said. "I'm done watching it, Rosalie. I heard you plan this," she said. 3 nights ago, you were in the saloon with Geller, and you said you'd come up here and get me back before Hale could file anything. And if Mercer gave you trouble, you'd bring someone bigger." She looked at the third man with the lantern. "That's him, I assume." The third man shifted his weight. Geller made a sound. "How did she ain't deaf?" "Frank," Walter said, and the control in his voice cracked just slightly on the last word. "She's never been deaf. She's been lying for 6 years, and making a fool out of everyone in Black Hollow." He looked at her, and the coldness in his face had something new in it now, not just calculation, but the particular fury of a man who has been outsmarted by someone he spent years believing was less than him. "You think that makes you look good? You think those county men are going to take the word of a woman who spent 6 years pretending to be something she wasn't? She spent 6 years surviving something she shouldn't have had to survive," Silas said from behind her. And his voice was still quiet, but it had a quality in it now, like the moment before weather turned. "And everything she told Hale, she can back up with specifics your friends at the county office can't explain away." "You stay out of this," Walter said. "Sharp. This is between me and my daughter." "She's not your daughter," Silas said. "She's a woman you tried to sell for $20. That's the last connection you had to her. And it ended when I put a coin on that bar." Walter took another step forward, and Geller moved with him, and the third man set the lantern down, and Rosalie heard the shift in the situation the way she heard everything by its weight, by what it was about to do, and she said, clearly and without raising her voice, "Don't." It stopped all 3 of them, not Silas. Silas hadn't moved. She stepped off the cabin threshold and onto the ground, putting herself in the space between her father and the door. And she looked at Walter Briggs directly, not sideways. Not at the ground, not through the practiced blankness she'd used for 6 years, but straight at him, in the way she'd never quite been able to do before, or had never allowed herself. "I need to say something to you," she said. "And you're going to stand there and hear it." Walter's eyes narrowed. "You don't tell me. I heard you the night Mama died," she said. He stopped. She hadn't planned to start there, But it came out with the certainty of something that had been waiting for exactly this moment. In exactly this cold, in exactly this dark, with the mountains around them and no walls between. "You were in the other room," she said. "I was 14. I'd been listening at the wall all night because I was scared and I didn't know what else to do. And when she stopped breathing, you were quiet for a long time, and then you said," she steadied her voice. "You said finally." The word fell between them like a stone into still water. Walter's face went completely blank. "I heard it," she said. "I've carried it for 10 years. I told myself I misheard. I told myself you were just that it was the grief talking. That you didn't mean it, that you loved her and you were just exhausted." She looked at him without flinching. "But you did mean it, didn't you? She was tired and you were tired of her being tired, and when she was gone you felt—" "Stop," Walter said. And for the first time his voice was different, not controlled. Not calculating. "I'm not stopping," she said. "I stopped for 6 years. I pretended I couldn't hear, so I wouldn't have to hear things like that. So you couldn't see what knowing did to me." She took one step toward him. "I heard you plan the first forged land claim with Harris. I heard you and Geller talk about the Gruber survey. I heard every conversation you had in that boarding house for the last 2 years, because the walls were thin and you thought I was deaf, and you stopped being careful." She paused. "I wrote none of it down because I had no one to give it to. But I remember every word of it, every date, every name, every amount." Geller took a half step backward. The third man with the lantern had gone very still. Walter Briggs stood in the cold mountain dark and looked at his daughter, and she watched the calculation leave his face. Piece by piece, like ice breaking up in a spring thaw. Until what was underneath it was something she'd never seen from him before. He looked old, not the age she knew how old he was, but old the way men got, when the thing they'd built their confidence on dissolved. When the story they'd told themselves about who they were, and who the people around them were, stopped holding its shape. "You were never deaf," he said, and it came out almost like a question. "I was never deaf," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face. She had spent her whole life trying to read his face, and she still couldn't always name what she found there. But this was closer to grief than she expected. Not grief for her. Grief for the version of himself that had existed in his own telling of the story. Then it closed back up. "It doesn't matter," he said. And the control came back, thinner than before but present. "It doesn't matter what you heard. You're my daughter. Under the law, the Ward document is forged," she said. "You know it's forged. Hale knows it's forged, and when Helena files charges, Harris is going to tell everything he knows about you to reduce his own sentence. Because that's what men like Harris do, and you know that too." Walter looked past her at Silas. "How much?" he said. "To make this go away, all of it. How much do you want?" Silas said nothing. Mercer. "I'm talking to you. Manda, how much?" "She already told you," Silas said. "There's nothing to make go away. It's done. Everything has a price," Walter said. "Everything. I know that better than anyone." "You know the price of everything," Rosalie said. "You never knew the value of anything." He looked at her. She looked back, and she saw the exact moment he understood that she wasn't afraid of him. Not performing bravery, not holding back by force of will genuinely. Foundationally not afraid. The way you stopped being afraid of a thing once you'd seen it clearly enough for long enough that the mystery that fed the fear was gone. She knew what he was. She'd known for years, and he could no longer do anything to her that she hadn't already survived. He knew it, too, he said. Walter Geller started. I said, "Let's go." Geller looked at Rosalie. There was something in his face she hadn't expected, not quite shame, but close enough to its neighbor that she noted it. He turned and walked back down the path without another word. The third man picked up his lantern and followed. Walter Briggs stood alone for one more moment. "I did the best I could," he said, and his voice was strange, not defensive. "Just stated. The way you stated a fact you knew was insufficient, but had nothing better to replace it with. She thought about a lot of different things she could say to that. She chose the truest one. "I know," she said. And it wasn't enough. He turned and walked down the mountain path, and the lantern light went with him, and the dark came back in around the cabin. And Rosalie stood in the cold and breathed and let the shaking come, because it was coming whether she invited it or not. The body's honest accounting of what the mind had just done, and she let it move through her without trying to stop it. Silas's hand came to rest on her shoulder, not pulling her in, not turning her around. Just there. She put her hand over his and held on for a moment. Then she stepped back and turned around and walked into the cabin. He followed. She sat down at the table and he put a cup of water in front of her and sat across from her and waited. And she drank the water and the shaking slowed, and she looked at her own hands on the table and thought about the word finally spoken in a dark room 10 years ago. And about carrying it for 10 years, and about the particular weight of a thing you carry so long it stops feeling like a burden, and starts feeling like part of your own body. She thought about setting it down. She thought about what her hands might feel like without it. "You all right?" said. "I will be," she said. Not the automatic answer, the true one. He nodded. "I told him things I've never said out loud," she said. "About my mother. About what I heard." She looked at the cup. "I didn't plan it. Sometimes the right moment does the planning," he said. She looked at him. "He looked old," she said, "when I said it." He looked like the floor had dropped out from under the story he'd been telling himself. She paused. "I thought I'd feel something when that happened. Satisfaction. Maybe. Or anger. I've had enough anger stored up." She shook her head. "I just felt tired. That's what's true," Silas said. "Tired is what's true, when you've been carrying something heavy for a long time and you finally put it down. Satisfaction comes later." She looked at him for a moment. "Is that what happened with you?" she said. "After your wife. After you came up here." He turned his cup on the table. "Took about 2 years," he said. "The tired. Then one morning I woke up and the air smelled different and I thought he stopped. Tried again. I thought it's still a good world, even with what happened in it. Still a good world." He looked at her steadily. "You'll get there." She held his gaze and thought about the years ahead of her, the charges. The hearing, the long process of legal consequence that would grind forward slowly the way legal things did. And Walter Briggs, somewhere at the end of it facing what he'd done. And herself, somewhere at the other end of the same long road. On the far side of it, looking back. She thought about what was on the other side. She thought she was starting to see the shape of it. "I want to go to Black Hollow tomorrow," she said. Not to run from what just happened, because of it. She straightened. "Hale will need a formal written statement. I want to give it before Walter gets back to town and starts managing the story." "That's smart," Silas said. "I know it's smart," she said, and there was almost something like dry humor in it. Just the trace of it, and she saw it register in his face. "First thing in the morning," he said. She nodded and stood and went to the cot and lay down and pulled the blanket up and stared at the ceiling. And the fire burned low, and Silas went back to the chair, and the mountains settled around them, and she breathed in the dark and thought about her mother, and the word finally, and the weight she'd been carrying, and the shape of what might be waiting on the other side of it. She slept 3 hours. She woke to frost on the window glass and Silas already at the stove. And the smell of coffee, and the ordinary sounds of a morning that intended to continue regardless of what the night before had held. She got up. She washed her face. She looked at herself in the mirror. Still here. Still thinking. But different. In a way she was going to need time to map fully. The way you needed time to understand the shape of a landscape you'd crossed in the dark. She'd figure it out. She was good at that. They rode down the mountain in the early light. Side by side where the road allowed, single file where it narrowed. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The silence between them had a different quality from the silence of that first ride 3 weeks ago, not the silence of two strangers measuring the danger of each other, but the silence of two people who had run out of the need to perform and hadn't yet run out of things to say. The difference between those two silences, Rosalie thought, was larger than it sounded. Black Hollow appeared below them as the road curved around the last long ridge, the cluster of buildings. The smear of chimney smoke, the particular gray-brown color of a mining town in morning fog. She'd thought she might feel something stark when she saw it. Fear or anger or the specific dread of return, she felt clear. Not unafraid, she was not foolish enough to believe she was walking back into simple circumstances. Her father was down there. Geller was down there. Harris, the county recorder, was down there. And she was about to put her name on documents that would make all three of them face consequences they would not accept peacefully. But she was clear. She knew what she was doing, and she knew why, and she knew what she was worth. Which was not $20, and not the amount of Walter Briggs's debts, and not whatever the men in the crooked spurt he had that night, 3 weeks ago. She knew what she was worth because someone had handed her the decision about her own life and let her make it. And in making it, she'd found out what she was made of. The town road came up under them, and the horses' hooves changed sound on the packed dirt of the main street, and people looked, they always looked, when Silas Mercer came into town. She understood now, that was just the fact of him, and she kept her spine straight and her chin level, and she looked back. The crooked spur was on the left. She looked at it as they passed. Looked at the swinging doors. Looked at the spot of dirt in front of it where Walter had dragged her 3 weeks ago. She looked at it, and it was just a building. That was all it was. Hale was at the assayer's office, which was the closest thing Black Hollow had to an official premises. And he looked up when they came in, and at Rosalie's expression he put down his pen immediately. "He came up last night," she said, before he could ask. "My father. He knows you were at the cabin." Hale's expression shifted. "Did he threaten you?" "He tried several approaches," she said. "None of them worked." She sat down across from him. "I need to give you a full written statement. Everything I told you yesterday, plus what happened last night." She folded her hands on the table. "And I need to know what happens next. Specifically. I need to understand the process so I can prepare for it." Hale looked at her for a moment. Looked at Silas in the doorway. "You sure you want to do this?" he said to her. "Once it's in writing and witnessed, there's no—" "I've been sure since I was 14 years old," she said. "I just didn't have anyone to give it to." She met his eyes. "I'm giving it to you now. Are you going to take it?" He picked up his pen. "Start from the beginning," he said. She started from the beginning. She talked for 2 hours. Hale wrote and asked clarifying questions and wrote more. And outside the assayer's office window, Black Hollow went about its morning. And somewhere in that morning, Walter Briggs was either drinking already or talking to someone, or planning something. But Rosalie found that she could hold that knowledge and not let it move her from the chair. She was a woman giving a sworn statement. She was a woman who remembered everything. She was a woman who had been silent for 6 years and had decided, on a cold mountain morning, that she was done. When she finished, Hale read the statement back to her in full, and she corrected 2 small details of phrasing. And then she picked up the pen he offered her, and she signed her name. Rosalie Bennett, both T's. She set the pen down and looked at what she'd written and felt something move through her chest, slow and large and clean. Like a window opened in a room that had been closed too long. "What happens now?" Silas said from the doorway. "I ride to Helena," Hale said. "I file this with the full office. A circuit judge will be appointed. Briggs and Harris will be summoned." He looked at Rosalie. "Months, possibly. You'll need to be available to testify." "I'll be available," she said. "Where will you be," he said, "if we need to reach you?" She looked at Silas. He was already looking at her. "She'll be reachable," he said. "I'll make sure of it." She held his gaze for a moment, this man who had put a coin on a bar because he'd seen her think, who had given her coffee and a cot and a rifle, and the unadorned daily practice of being treated like someone whose choices mattered. And she thought about what reachable meant, and what it meant that he'd said it without asking her first, and what it meant that she didn't mind. She turned back to Hale. "You have everything you need," she said. "More than enough," he said quietly. "Miss Bennett, what you've done here today takes considerable courage." She thought about a girl on her knees on a saloon floor. She thought about a woman standing in the cold at midnight with her father's voice in her ears and her hand on a door latch. "It takes practice," she said. "That's all it is. You practice until it becomes what you are." She stood up and walked to the door, and Silas stepped back to let her through, and they went out into the morning together, into the thin winter sunlight of Black Hollow's Main Street. And Rosalie stood on the boards outside the assayer's office and looked at the town that had watched her be sold for $20, and she breathed it in the cold. The coal smoke, the faint distant sound of a pickaxe on rock from the hillside, and she thought, "I am not afraid of this place. I was never afraid of this place. I was afraid of having no one in it who saw me." She looked at the man standing beside her. He wasn't looking at the town. He was looking at her. And the thing she'd filed away carefully and then filed more carefully again, and had been telling herself, was not yet the right time, for it moved in her chest with a certainty and a completeness that she recognized. Finally, for what it was, she didn't say it, not yet. But she let herself feel it, standing on the boards in the winter sunlight. And she didn't put it away this time. She let it stay. "Hungry?" She almost laughed. "Starving," she said. "There's a place on the south end that does decent eggs," he said. "If you can stand to be in this town a little longer." She looked at the street, at the people moving through it, some of whom had been in the Crooked Spur that night, some of whom had laughed, some of whom had simply watched. She looked at all of it and stood in her own skin and felt the ground solid under her feet. "I can stand it," she said. They walked south together, through the town, in the thin winter light, and the street parted around Silas the way it always did, and this time Rosalie walked in the space it made, and looked straight ahead and held her head level, and thought about practice. And what you became when you practiced long enough. And whether that was the same thing as who you always were underneath. She thought it might be. She thought she was just now finding out. The eggs were decent. Not good. The cook at the South End place had a heavy hand with the salt, and the bread was yesterday's, but Rosalie ate every bite and drank 2 cups of coffee and sat across from Silas in a public dining room in Black Hollow, Montana Territory, and nobody stared, and the world did not end. That felt like something worth noting. They didn't talk much over the meal. They didn't need to. The morning had already held more words than most days held. And the silence between them now had the particular quality of 2 people who had been through something together and were letting it settle before they decided what to say about it. She'd learned to trust that silence. It meant things were being processed, not avoided. She was on her 2nd cup of coffee when the door opened, and Frank Geller walked in. He stopped when he saw her. She looked at him steadily, and did not look away, and did not change her expression, and after a moment Geller, who had ridden up a mountain in the dark to threaten her, and had then walked back down it without a word when everything went, sideways looked at the floor, and turned around and left. Silas watched this over the rim of his cup. "That's the first time I've seen him back down from anything," he said. "He knows what's in that statement," Rosie said. "Hale's going to want to talk to him, too. You think he'll cooperate?" "I think he'll do whatever keeps him out of the worst trouble," she said. "He's not loyal to my father. He's loyal to his own skin." "That's a different thing entirely." Silas set his cup down. "You've got them all figured out, don't you?" "I've had a long time to listen," she said. "And nothing else to do with what I heard." He looked at her, that steady, patient look she'd come to know, as well as the sound of his boots on the cabin floor, and she thought for a moment he was going to say something significant. But he just picked his cup back up and drank, and she let it go. Some things, she was learning, came in their own time. They rode back up the mountain in the afternoon, the light going gold and cold, the way it did at this elevation in late November. And the horse moved at its own pace, and Rosalie sat easy in the saddle and watched the valley fall away below them and thought about what came next. What came next was waiting. Mostly. That was the shape of legal consequence. You did the brave thing in a morning, and then you waited months for the machinery to catch up. She knew that. She was prepared for it. What she wasn't entirely prepared for was the quiet of the cabin that evening. Not a bad quiet, not the quiet of absence or tension. Just the quiet of two people at the end of a significant day. At the fire, with the mountain dark outside, and the extraordinary ordinary fact that they were still here. Both of them, and the worst thing she'd been afraid of for 6 years had happened. Her father had stood in front of her and tried every version of power he had, and she was still here. Still thinking. She was staring at the fire when Silas said, "I need to tell you something." She turned. He was sitting in the chair, elbows on knees looking at his hands, not the ceiling. That meant this was something he'd already resolved. Not something he was still working through. "All right," she said. "When I first saw you in that saloon," he said, "the thing I told you was true. I got up because you were thinking, because you were still choosing even in the middle of that." He looked up. But there was something else. She waited. "You looked like her," he said. "My wife. Same age she was when I met her. Same way of holding herself like the world kept trying to take up space she'd already decided was hers." He looked back at his hands. "I want you to know that's not why I stayed. I want you to understand the difference." She was very still. "I stayed," he said, "because you are who you are. Not because of who you reminded me of for 30 seconds in a saloon." He looked up again, and his eyes were direct and certain. "I needed to say that plainly." She held his gaze for a long moment. "I know the difference," she said quietly. "I've been listening to you for 3 weeks. I know when you're seeing me and when you're somewhere else." She paused. "You've been seeing me." Something released in his face. "Yeah," he said, "I have." The fire burned and the wind moved in the pines outside, and neither of them said anything more for a while. But the silence had a new weight to it, not heavier. Just more honest, the way things got when the last hidden room in a building got opened. She went to bed that night and lay on the cot and thought about his wife, who had held herself like the world, who couldn't take up space she'd already claimed. And thought about her own mother, who had been tired. And thought about the long line of women who had come before both of them, doing the hard, unwitnessed work of surviving, and she thought, "I am part of that line. But I am not the end of it. I get to choose what comes after." She slept 7 hours. It was the most she'd slept in years. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that she would think about later, as the time she learned what it meant to actually live somewhere, as opposed to surviving it. There was a difference. Surviving a place meant every morning you woke up and checked the threats before you let yourself feel anything. Living somewhere meant you woke up, and the first thing you noticed was the quality of the light. She noticed the light. She kept shooting every morning and got better at it in a way that stopped surprising Silas and started being simply a fact about her. Like her ability to read legal documents or identify an animal by its movement in underbrush. She helped with the winter preparations, the cordwood and the food stores, and the 100 small tasks that kept a mountain cabin viable through a hard Montana winter, and found that she had opinions about how things ought to be done. And that Silas, without making a thing of it, listened to those opinions and occasionally changed course based on them. That felt like a miracle so small and so consistent that she almost missed it. Almost. The letter from Helena came on a Thursday in late December. Carried up by a rider Silas knew who made the mountain run twice a month. She read it at the table while Silas stood by the stove. Walter Briggs had been arrested on the 14th of December. Harris, the county recorder, had been arrested on the same day. 2 of the mining operators named in her statement had fled the territory. which would complicate proceedings but would not stop them. A circuit judge had been appointed. The hearing was scheduled for the second week of February in Helena. She would need to testify. She set the letter down. February, she's a month, Silas said. I know how calendars work, she said. And there was definitely something like humor in it this time. Something that had been quietly building for weeks. He looked at her with that almost smile. You want to go? I need to go, she said. There's a difference. I know there is, he said. I was asking which one it was. She looked at the letter. At her father's name printed in official ink. At the word arrested, sitting cleanly in the middle of a formal sentence. Both, she said finally. He nodded. I'll take you. I didn't ask you to. I know, he said. I'm offering. She looked at him for a long moment. This was the thing about Silas Mercer that she had never quite gotten used to. Even after weeks of daily evidence of it, the way he offered things without requiring her to ask. Without making the offering a demonstration of his own generosity. Without needing her gratitude to make it feel real. He just did it the way he did everything, because it was the next right thing and he'd decided to do it. All right, she said. He turned back to the stove. Silas, she said. Thank you, she said. Not for this specific thing, for all of it. She knew he'd understand that. And she knew he wouldn't make her say the rest. He held her gaze. You'd have gotten here without me, he said. Maybe differently. Maybe longer. But you'd have gotten here. Maybe, she said. But I didn't have to do it the long way. He went back to the stove. She folded the letter and held it in her hands, and felt the weight of February waiting for her in the courtroom. The judge, the formal recounting of everything she'd heard and held, and now finally got to say in a room where it counted, and she thought, I am ready for this. I have been ready for this for years. Christmas came quietly, the way everything came on the mountain. She had not celebrated Christmas in 5 years. Walter didn't observe it. Or rather, he observed the drinking that surrounded it and ignored the rest, and she'd forgotten what it felt like to mark a day as distinct from the others. But Silas came back from his monthly supply run with a paper bag of hard candies and set them on the table on the 25th without ceremony. And she sat across from him and ate a peppermint, and he ate a lemon drop, and she looked at the man across from her and thought about what her life had been a year ago. A month ago, 3 weeks ago, and what it was right now. What are you thinking, he said. She'd said that to him. Once, the first week over breakfast. He'd looked at his plate and taken a long time and said something true. She owed him the same. I'm thinking this is the first Christmas I've spent not being afraid, she said. He looked at her steadily. Of anything, he said. Of the day, she said. Of what he'd be like. Of whether the quiet was good or whether it meant something worse was coming. She turned a candy wrapper in her hands. I spent so long listening for danger that I forgot you could also just listen because the sounds were good. She paused. I've been listening to this mountain for 2 months now. It has very good sounds. He was quiet for a moment. It does, he said. It took me a while to hear them too. She looked up. How long? About 2 years, he said. And then one morning the air was different. She remembered him saying this before the air was different. And he thought it was still a good world. She held it now alongside everything she knew about him that she hadn't known then and understood it differently. It took you 2 years, she said, and you're telling me I'm doing all right at 2 months. I'm telling you you're doing better than all right, he said. I'm telling you that what I see when I look at you is not someone recovering from something. It's someone who already knows who they are and is just now getting the space to be it. She looked at the candy wrapper in her hands. She looked at him. Silas, and her voice was different from any version of her voice she'd heard herself use before, not the careful flat voice of performed deafness. Not the precise voice she used on documents and in statements. Not even the voice she'd found over weeks of morning coffee at this table. Something underneath all of those. The voice she'd had before things went wrong, and she'd had to put it somewhere safe. Yeah, he said. Soft, like he heard it too. I don't know what this is, she said. What we are. I don't know the right word for it. We don't have to have the right word for it, he said. I know, she said. I want to say something true about it. Before February, before Helena and the courtroom and all of it, she looked at her hands. In case things get complicated and I don't say it when it's still simple. He waited. She looked up at him. I don't want to leave, she said. I've spent 6 years wanting to leave everywhere I was. And I don't want to leave here. She paused. I want to stay. I want this to be the place I'm from, after everything. I want to be a person who's from somewhere. Her voice held steady. And I want that somewhere to be here with you. Silas was very still. She felt the word hanging between them and felt the old reflex, the one that said, take it back. Qualify it. Give yourself the exit before someone else takes it from you, and she let the reflex pass through her without following it. She'd practiced not flinching. She was done flinching. He leaned forward with his elbows on the table and looked at her with those steady, weathered eyes that had seen things she was only beginning to understand, and said, I was going to wait until after February to say anything. I know, she said. I didn't want to wait. You never do. Once you've decided. Is that a problem, he said. It's my favorite thing about you, she breathed. He reached across the table, and his hand covered hers, not taking it. Not gripping, just covering, the way you covered something you wanted to be careful with, and he said, I want you to stay. I've wanted you to stay since about the 5th morning. When you told me about your mother and then ate your eggs without making it a thing. He paused. But I need you to stay because you want to, not because it's safe. Not because it's better than what you came from. Because you chose it. Specifically, on its own terms. She looked at his hand on hers. She looked at him. I choose it, she said specifically. On its own terms, he exhaled. They sat like that for a moment, two people on a mountain in December, with hard candy on the table between them and a fire burning, and the particular quality of silence that came after something important had been said plainly, and then Rosalie turned her hand over under his and held on. And that was that. February came. Helena was larger than Black Hollow by a considerable measure. And louder. And the courthouse was a proper building with a proper judge and a gallery that was half-filled on the day of the hearing with people who had heard enough of the story to want to see its ending. She had not expected that. She had expected a small official proceeding with documents and careful language. She had not expected to walk in and find people watching. She felt Silas at her shoulder, not close enough to suggest she needed steadying. Just there, the way he was always just there. And she walked to the front of the room and sat where they told her to sit and looked at the judge, who was a gray-haired man with the precise, impersonal expression of someone who had been doing this long enough to know that impartiality was the whole job. Walter Briggs was at the other table. She looked at him. He looked older than he had on the mountain, smaller. The room had a way of doing that to a man, putting him in a chair and surrounding him with the formal weight of consequence and showing exactly how much space he actually took up without whiskey and volume and the particular cruelty that had always been his substitute for authority. He didn't meet her eyes. She looked away first because she had nothing left to prove in that direction. The hearing was long and precise, and she gave her testimony with the same clarity and organization she'd given Hale, answering questions directly and without embellishment and correcting the defense attorney twice when he misquoted her previous statement, which she had memorized because she memorized everything. The defense attorney gave up trying to rattle her on the 3rd attempt. Harris testified and said more than he probably intended to. Because Hale had been right, Harris was loyal only to the reduction of his own sentence, and he would say whatever the room needed him to say to get it. Walter's own attorney spent an hour trying to establish that Rosalie's history of performing deafness made her an unreliable witness. The judge considered this argument for approximately 4 minutes. Then he said, "In the dry level tone of a man who had long since learned to say difficult things plainly. The witness demonstrated knowledge of specific dates, names and figures that cannot be explained except by direct exposure. The question of how she came to possess that knowledge is relevant, only insofar as it confirms she was present and attentive. Both have been established. The argument is dismissed. She heard Silas exhale 1 row behind her. She didn't let herself react. She sat with her hands folded on the table and her back straight, and she waited for the rest of it. The rest of it took 2 more hours, when the judge rendered his finding fraud in the first degree. 3 counts: Walter Briggs, fraud and falsification of official documents. 6 counts: Harris. She heard the gallery murmur, and she looked at her hands on the table and breathed. She had known it was coming. Knowing and feeling still ran on different tracks. She felt it now. Not satisfaction. Silas had been right. Satisfaction was too simple a word for it. It was more like the specific physical relief of a thing you'd braced against for so long, that when it finally stopped pushing back, your whole body had to remember how to stand upright without the pressure. She walked out of the courthouse into the February cold and stood on the steps, and Silas came out behind her and stood beside her, and they looked at Helena's main street for a moment, without speaking. "You all right?" he said. "I keep being asked that," she said. "People keep meaning it," he said. She looked at the street. At the people moving through it, none of whom knew her name or her story. None of whom had been in the Crooked Spur the night her father raised her arm like livestock and tried to sell her for $20. Anonymous people on an ordinary street on an ordinary February afternoon. Living their lives. She was going to go back to the mountain. She was going to wake up tomorrow and make coffee and go out to the flat stretch behind the cabin and shoot until her shoulder burned. And Silas would stand to the side and say "natural" when she hit the thing she was aiming at. And the bird in the eastern pines would call 3 times at the same hour. And the horse would stamp twice before it wanted water. And all of it, every single ordinary particular of it, would be hers. Not because anyone gave it to her, because she'd chosen it. "Let's go home," she said. She felt him still beside her. She'd said it without thinking, or rather, she'd said it without deciding. Which was different, which meant it had already been true for long enough that it had stopped needing a decision. "Yeah," he said. "Let's go home." They rode out of Helena in the afternoon, and the mountains came up around them, and the cold was clean and bright, and the horse knew the way. And Rosalie rode with her spine straight and her face to the mountain, and thought about everything that had brought her to this road. On this afternoon, the saloon floor. The coin on the bar, the wool blanket, the coffee, the rifle, the ward document, the statement, the courtroom. And underneath all of it, running all the way back to the beginning, the single word that had changed the entire direction of her life. Choice. A drunk man in a saloon had tried to sell her future for $20. A quiet man in the back of that same saloon had stood up and said the thing no one had ever said to her. In her hearing or out of it, her choice. And she had chosen. She had chosen to nod in a saloon. She had chosen to speak one word in the dark outside. She had chosen to stay, and to practice, and to talk, and to trust and to testify, and to sign her name on a document with both T's in the right place. She had chosen every step of the road that brought her here. To this horse, on this mountain, beside this man, going home. Not home like the word meant safety or ease or the absence of hard things. Home like the word meant the place you'd decided was yours and intended to keep deciding was yours. Every morning, for as long as you got mornings. That kind of home she could build. That kind of home she intended to. The cabin came into view as the last light left the sky, the dark shape of it against the granite. The cold window, the unlit fire waiting inside. She dismounted before Silas and went to the door and pushed it open, and the smell of it hit her wood smoke and old pine and coffee, and the particular scent of a place that had absorbed 2 people's presence over months and made something new out of it. She stood in the doorway and breathed it in. Behind her, Silas was seeing to the horse. She heard his low voice and the horse's answering breath and the particular sounds of a man at home doing the things a man at home did. She crossed to the fireplace and knelt and built the fire the way he'd shown her. Fast and practical, kindling first then the larger pieces. And it caught on the second strike, and she sat back and watched it take hold. Silas came in, closed the door behind him, stopped when he saw the fire already going. She looked at him over her shoulder. "I know how to do it now," she said. He looked at the fire, at her. "Yeah," he said, and his voice had that quality in it, the warm, quiet, unperformed quality that she'd learned to recognize as the sound of something real. "You do." She turned back to the fire and he moved to the stove, and they were in the same room doing the same things they always did in the evening. And it was ordinary, and it was warm, and it was exactly what she had chosen. And she held that knowledge in her chest like something she intended to keep. She thought about her mother, who had been tired. She thought about June Bennett, who had come to Montana Territory at 23, full of belief that things could be something, and who had spent her strength holding a life together that kept coming apart. She thought, "I am finishing what you started, Mama. I am building the thing you were trying to build. I am in the place you were trying to get to." The fire popped. The coffee started. Silas said something quiet and she answered, and he said something else and she actually laughed. A real one, not the careful, measured thing she'd rationed for years, but a full, unguarded sound that filled the cabin and surprised her with its own existence, and he looked at her when she laughed with an expression she would spend a long time trying to find adequate language for, and eventually stop trying. Because some things were more themselves when you didn't put them into words. Years later, and there would be years, she was certain of that now. The way you were certain of the sounds that belonged to a mountain you knew well. People in Black Hollow still told the story. They had the broad shape of it right, the night Walter Briggs dragged his daughter into the crooked spur and tried to sell her, and the mountain man who stood up from the back of the room and put a coin on the bar. They had the details wrong, which was the way of stories. They said he bought her. They said she was grateful. They said he saved her. All of that was close enough to the shape of a story that it satisfied the people telling it. And Rosalie had stopped correcting them, because the correction required explaining things that were harder than the story, things about choice and survival, and the difference between being rescued and being seen, things about what it meant to be handed back your own agency by someone who understood that it was never theirs to hand in the first place. The truth was this: Silas Mercer had not saved Rosalie Bennett. He had stood up in a room full of men who had already decided what she was worth, and he had offered her a choice, and she had taken it. And everything that followed had come from her taking it. She had saved herself. She had been saving herself her entire life. In the dark, with no one watching, with nothing but 6 years of stored-up truth, and a voice she'd refused to let go of, even when she'd stopped using it. Silas had given her the moment. She had given herself everything else. And on the mountain above Black Hollow, Montana Territory, in a cabin with a fire burning and coffee on the stove and a rifle on the wall that she could shoot better than any man in the county, Rosalie Bennett, who had spent 6 years silent, 6 years invisible, 6 years waiting for a night when running was possible, was done waiting. She was already home. She had chosen it, and she was never letting it go.